kind of car is that shit? What is that shit? Anybody know what this is?
Time is a valuable commodity, yet time itself cannot create. It can only take away from us. Our time is limited, and so are the things here on Earth that we love and enjoy. Time and the laws of physics haven't been kind to this car in particular. Although due to the sentimental nature of how it was put together, it has remained on the road longer than it safely should have. Every square inch of this car was already losing to the sands of time, when finally, in August 2020, the car took one fatal blow to the transmission from an improperly placed steel plate.
I don't know if the video picks it up, but the transmission is whining really bad. So I think this car's getting parked for a while.
Since August 2020, the car has been sitting in the dark depths of storage, awaiting its final fate. In February 2021, I succeeded in replacing the transmission and successfully installed new front struts to restore the factory ride height. However, the floor jack I was using started to go through the left rear floor pan while installing the rear springs. Along with some other findings while making the repairs, it was pretty clear that the car had deteriorated to a point that it was no longer safe to operate on public roads. If I was going to continue to allow this project to exist, I needed to transfer it into a low-rust chassis to ensure the safety of myself and others on the road. For years, I had been keeping tabs on a few different shadows in the area with similar specs, like this green one that I had seen floating around the eastern shore of Delaware. In late 2018, before I even bought the Quadrajet Shadow, I accidentally met the owner at a bar and found out he was a contractor doing some work for a family property on the shore. I told him I would be interested in buying the car when it either broke down or when he got something different to daily drive, regardless of what condition it was in when he went to sell it. Well, in August of 2021, I finally got the call and was in a good position to buy it, especially given my situation. During Labor Day weekend, I drove out to take a look at it again up close, since it had been some time since I looked at it previously, and concluded that this car was the perfect candidate for the swap. The body was straight, with easily addressable rust and cosmetic dings and dents, but otherwise ready for a fresh paint job. The interior left a lot to be desired, but I had a complete interior to swap in from the original car. After making the purchase, I parked it in the quiet beach town of Fenwick Island, Delaware, and drove home to Virginia to get it titled and registered. I returned a few weeks later in early October to transport it back. Normally I would trailer something like this, but the car trailer that I normally use was unavailable that weekend, so I decided to try my luck driving it back. It's no secret that these cars have some hard to solve cooling system gremlins, and I've had my share of roadside shame with my other Shadow, so I'm already not super hopeful about driving back. These cars do great on short drives, but almost always seem to start acting up if they're driven continuously for more than an hour or so. Taking Route 50 from Ocean City all the way through Easton, the car actually ran pretty cool. It's normal for the temp gauge to swing between 1/3 and 2/3 as the car is driving, and a gauge that gravitates more and more towards 2/3 usually indicates a potential problem. As I approached Kent Island, it started doing just that. Having been driving for about 2 hours now, this should have been a good warning to stop and at least check the cooling system, especially since I was approaching the 4-mile long Chesapeake Bay Bridge, which doesn't have a shoulder to pull off on. but the gauge still had a little bit to go before reaching hot. So I decided to try and power through a little longer so I could stop at one of my favorite Wawas just on the other side of the bridge. As I began to cross this longer bridge, the gauge was already at about 2/3, and as I climbed to the peak of the bridge, it became more and more evident that there was a problem, as the gauge proceeded to immediately crawl past 2/3 and go right to H. All I could do at this point was force the car to suffer for my automotive sin and hope that it did not decide to shut off in protest before reaching the top of the bridge. Upon reaching the exit for Wawa, the unmistakable smell of escaping coolant was now evident, and I was probably seconds away from serious overheat when I made it into the lot, but it was not immediately clear where it was leaking from. I continued to drive a while longer until the car overheated yet again, this time shutting off on me under the Route 50-301 interchange in Bowie, Maryland. This time though, the leak was immediately apparent, and I was able to fill the radiator once more and crawl to the nearest auto parts store where they had a matching upper radiator hose. After replacing this hose, the remainder of the trip was uneventful and the car stayed under 2/3 for the rest of the drive. Since we'll be transferring the gray interior from the original car, we can strip out the entire interior of this car. Since tan interiors are a little bit more rare than gray ones, I will try to salvage as much of this interior as possible for the Peabody community. But since a lot of it is in rough shape, I'm not going to make an effort to hold on to every single piece. And as you can see, a lot of the carpet and soft upholstery is in pretty bad shape. One thing I did opt to keep in for now was the dashboard and instrument cluster, since I would need to be able to move the car around for a little bit until I was ready to fully paint it. With the interior stripped down, we're going to take it one step further and strip down the doors completely, including the glass, weather stripping, and door hardware. With the door removed, we can also lay it horizontally in a well-lit area, which will further allow us to detect any issues with the bodywork. While both doors and most of the rest of the body are in excellent shape, there are still a few small dents that I want to fill in with some body filler, and we'll start by wet sanding both doors as well as the fenders. The driver's side doors on Dodge Shadows are notoriously famous for losing alignment and taking out the front fender with them. Since this happens so often, including on all three of my cars, nobody has a spare driver's fender, yet there is a huge surplus of free passenger fenders throughout the community. So in order to save a decent bit of money and a trip to the Midwest, we're going to attempt to fix this one with a welder, some hammers, and body filler. Once the metal is welded and hammered back into place as best as possible, we can wet sand the panel and then use the body filler as we normally would. With the doors and fenders wet sanded and bondoed, we can do the same to the car itself. Give everything a quick wipe down with some acetone, and verify everything that I don't want to get paint on is masked off. Once that's done, we can open our first can of paint, which is the gray primer. Now, I've never sprayed any kind of automotive paint product before, so this is the first time I've ever opened one of these cans or mixed it together. And here goes. And I know I'll probably get a little bit of criticism for this, but keep in mind this is the first time I've ever used a spray gun on a car with this type of paint. So while I don't have a perfect technique here, I'd say based on what I've read and watched, and looking back on this footage while editing it, that I'm doing a pretty decent job. Now, I will say that the gray primer is pretty forgiving, and you are supposed to spray it on fairly thick, and this will allow us to sand it later to make the surface smooth and look for any imperfections we may have missed. Because if it shows up in the primer, it's definitely going to show up in the color coat and possibly even the clear coat. So it is important to get it right the first time and go back and sand and reprime where needed. Once the primer is on the car, we can let it dry and check for any imperfections and repeat where necessary until the body is nice and smooth and evenly painted. While primer is very forgiving and can be sprayed outside on a relatively calm and dry night, it is imperative that the color coat and clear coat are done in the cleanest environment possible. Now, I could buy one of those inflatable paint booths or hire a paint shop to do the actual color coat with the car already disassembled, but I wanted to try and seek out a budget-friendly option first. So I went to Home Depot and bought about $20 worth of PVC pipe, some pipe hanger, and a box of painter's plastic. Since a Dodge Shadow is approximately 6 feet wide with the mirrors and about 14 or 14.5 feet long, a paint booth approximately 10 feet wide by 20 feet long should fit the needs of this project. I probably could have made it a little bit wider with the space I am in, but in order to save time and money, I opted to stick to the 10-foot lengths available off the shelf. I also wanted to make sure that outside of this booth, as much of the garage as possible remained usable, since this booth would probably be set up through the summer. Once the pipe was laid out in a shape that I liked, I used some metal pipe strap to hang it from the ceiling using drywall screws where the pipe crossed over studs. This would ensure that the pipe could support the extra weight of the plastic tarp as it was attached to the pipe. Since the plastic tarp is fairly lightweight, I'm just using Gorilla Tape to tape it directly to the pipe. I taped up tarp on all four sides and taped the other end to the ground to create a mostly airtight seal. One thing I wanted to do but didn't really have the patience for was figure out how to close in the top. If I did not need to open the garage doors to access things, I probably could use the same tarp material and just tape it really good across the top. And maybe I will do this in a future episode when we go to paint the actual car, but since we're starting with the accessories here, I wanted to see how effective just taping off the sides would be to keeping paint dust off of the other stuff in the garage. And I know what you're thinking, oh no, that beautiful Corvette in the background. Well, don't worry, I'm putting a tarp on top of that as well because I really do not want purple sparkles on that white paint. So the first accessories I wanted to paint were the wheels, since wheels are pretty forgiving since they're spinning half the time, so if I mess up the paint, it's going to be kind of hard to notice. And I'll gain some more practice with the paint gun since the wheel has a fairly sophisticated shape with several crevices and corners that are hard to get to. Wheels are also a complete pain to sand down for paint. I started with a wire brush, but it was clear that this wasn't scuffing up the finish enough, so I tried media blasting them, which seemed to work okay on certain parts, but still was not aggressive enough to rough up the surface. I also got glass beads everywhere, and I'm still finding them to this day. Finally, I tried some wire wheels from Harbor Freight, and this seemed to do the trick. I was able to get the finish off relatively quickly compared to the other methods. To make sure that the wheels are completely clean of any blasting material or contaminants, we'll give them all a good pressure washing on the front. I gave up on washing the rears since they were covered in brake dust. Once the wheels are cleaned and dried, we can apply painter's tape to the outer edge of the rim. Ideally, we would have the tires removed from the rims for painting, but since they were mounted relatively recently, it would not be financially feasible to remove them again. We'll do the same as we did on the car itself and apply a little bit of acetone to remove any contaminants and prep the surface for better adhesion. To make paint cleanup a lot easier without wasting all of the blue tape, we can apply some tire shine to the exposed part of the tire. The paint will probably still adhere to an extent, but as the wheels are driven on, it should help the paint flake off very easily. We'll start with our primer as we did with the body, making sure to evenly and thoroughly coat the wheels. Once the primer has had a little bit of time to dry, we can finally open the color can and see what it looks like. The mixing procedure will be almost identical to that of the primer, however there is metallic flake in this color, so it is imperative that it is thoroughly mixed and stirred regularly if it sits for an extended period of time. Immediately upon beginning application, it was clear that this paint was a lot thinner than the primer, which made it a lot easier to control coming out of the spray gun. Normally on the color coat, you would set the widest possible fan on your spray gun, but since these wheels are pretty small, I'm using a much narrower spray pattern and a much lighter flow rate. We'll repeat this application process every 5 to 10 minutes depending on the temperature, and then apply 2 generously thick coats of clear coat. These 2 clear coats will also be about 5 to 10 minutes apart depending on temperature and humidity. In a separate session, I tried my luck at painting again with some of the ground effects panels, using both my first-hand experience from painting the wheels along with some advice from professionals, and I'd say I did a pretty decent job on these as well. only issue I really came across with these parts was small contaminants either from the gun or from the ambient air that were landing in the paint as it was drying. If I can figure out how to at least partially mitigate these contaminants, I feel pretty confident that I can spray the rest of the body with little to no issues, as well as buff out the imperfections on these pieces that were just painted. But that's a video for another day.